Okay, we're going to continue and finish this chapter. So, in the ways we just described, the doctrine of separate spheres created this very rigid gender system in which certain aspects of human behavior became divided into male and female. And so, here's along gender lines. And so, how this worked out was that moral virtue belonged to women, rational and intellectual interests to men. Women, as mothers, were responsible for, quote, watching over the hearts and minds of our youthful citizens. And we get nationalism into that again, right? And this was their role in forming national character. And along with moral virtue, women had a monopoly on sexual purity, and men were condemned to this huge struggle with their unseemly physical urges. In this way, the ability to have a real sexuality was divided along gender lines. Women's role was to love and nurture, men's was the economic function. Women continued to grow food, tend animals, cook, repair household implements, make clothing, etc. But now these were viewed not as economic activities, but as, quote, acts of love. The doctrine of separate spheres gave us a new word, housework. Once all work was housework, as we have talked about. So let's look at separate spheres in a global perspective. Now, of course, what we just described was much more relevant to people with money, where there could be a male breadwinner, with men with good jobs. So the working class families were less capable of achieving the goal of a male breadwinner and stay-at-home mother, because these mothers in the working class families had to supplement family income often by working for upper class women, as maids or nannies or whatever. And immigrant women and African American women were also less likely to follow the doctrine of separate spheres. It did apply to many white married women, especially those with children. But this is an interesting point. It has always been proscriptive rather than a perfect description of how people really live their lives. Proscriptive means it's how it should be, right? So African American, Latino, and Native American families in the US face discrimination that often actually prevents them from achieving the economic success required from a male breadwinner and a stay-at-home mom. In many of these communities, this is interesting too, there are what are known as other mothers, and it's all one word spelled together, other mothers. And those are women who may or may not be related, biologically related, but they play a crucial role in assisting blood mothers with caring and raising children, caring for and raising children. There are also women-centered networks of grandmothers, sisters, aunts, or cousins that act as other mothers. And some of you may have experienced these women-centered networks. They're very powerful and can be very nurturing. Grandmothers are especially important in the welfare of children in many African American urban communities. And, it's not just in those communities anymore. There's an increasing demographic of white American grandparents having to parent their grandchildren in their retirement years. In fact, I just read a story not too long ago about people who can't retire. They were going to retire, but because of the incredible fentanyl and other drug epidemics, they wind up with their grandchildren. And so in many cases in those middle class families, the fathers have to continue, grandfathers and up to the children have to continue, the husbands have to continue working and can't retire because they're raising that. And it's, I looked up the stats, 2.7 million in the United States grandparents are continuing, are raising their grandchildren. So let's look at transnational motherhood, because this is really interesting too. Sorry about that. Many African American, hold on just a sec. Okay. Many African American and Caribbean Sorry about that. We have a helicopter buzzing around outside and it drives the dog crazy. So we'll go on. So we were talking about women having to leave their children at home, transnational mothers. So many African American and Caribbean women have left their children in the South or their native countries to work in the North. And in Mexican and Latin American women now leave children at home in their countries of origin to work in the United States uh, instead of bringing them with them. And that's called transnational motherhood. And it's due to economic pressures, of course. So, transnational Latina mothers make an important distinction between two kinds of mothers, okay? So the Latina mothers that are transnational Latina mothers who come here to work, and they make a distinction between those mothers who are estranged from their children or abandon their children or disown them or put them up for adoption. And those are behaviors that the Latina mothers who come here to work really generally disapprove of other mothers doing, because the ones who come here to work emphasize that they, quote, mother their children at a distance by taking on the talking on the phone or sending them gifts and letters and that type of thing. For these women, motherhood is transformed to include aspects of the typically male good provider role model. The mothers become the breadwinners, and they feel that their work not only helps economically, but shields children from the discrimination and racism that they themselves feel in the United States. So they leave their children back in their country of origin in order to shield them from racism and discrimination. But they are good mothers because they are sending, they're supporting their children by sending remittances home, of course, money, but also toys and gifts and phone calls and that type of thing. What about disability? What about mothers with disabilities? And the title of this is kind of sad, of this section, because it kind of tells you where it's at. It's called Disability and Risky Mothers. Because our ideal of motherhood implies that the parent should be physically present, a requirement that transnational parents, for example, struggle to meet. And mothers with disabilities are at a disadvantage because of the modern concept of intensive mothering. And what disability scholars, I really think this is an interesting concept called the normalcy project, that we should all be normal, right? If we're not normal, then we are, as they say, we often become defined as, quote, risky mothers. And that's primarily because of two issues. So that concept of intensive mothering, and which is also known as, quote, total motherhood or, quote, scientific motherhood, is a modern ideal in which being a good mother becomes all consuming. Mothers, and this is where you kind of get helicopter parents. This is where this comes from, this concept of intensive mothering, total motherhood, scientific motherhood. Mothers are supposed to act in partnership with medical and scientific experts, so that can be educational experts as well. And in places like the US, to be up to date on the latest scientific and medical knowledge about raising children. But of course, the partnership isn't equal because doctors' knowledge takes precedent, and so you get this what's called the medicalization of motherhood, and that's especially apparent in American attitudes towards pregnancy, where the needs of the mother now increasingly take second place to those of their unborn children. And there's a table to explain that too, table 8.1. We're certainly seeing that now with the Roe v. Wade the abortion issue in the United States. So I thought that was interesting that popped up in the book. So the Normalcy Project is the other issue, and that's a concept that originated at the intersection of feminism and disability. And what the Normalcy Project does is it describes how science and medicine are preoccupied with eradicating disability, and that it prizes a typical body. So in relation to motherhood, not a quote disabled body, it prizes a normal body, a typical body. In relation to motherhood, it demands that women perform as, quote, perfectly normal producers, and any deviation from that is seen as dangerous and irresponsible. Of course, the, quote, perfect motherhood experience is more available to white, middle class, cis women. Mothers are expected to possess healthy, quote, typical bodies. The problem is really very apparent with because deaf and disabled mothers experienced the highest rates of intervention, including the threat of having their children removed from their care. And they often feel like they have to perform a perfect version of motherhood in front of medical professionals. So that is a very difficult thing to think about, that there's that much discrimination and prejudice against deaf and disabled mothers. So we're going to move on now to the household division of labor and think about this on a little deeper, more sociological level. The good provider role dictates that a man's primary obligation to his family is to work to meet their material needs. He doesn't need to perform day-to-day tasks of caring for children or keeping the household running. So that idea, that concept, good provider role, it really narrows a man's obligation to his family to its economic value, which can create tension between the worlds of work and home. Because a man fulfilling that obligation of being the good provider is going to spend as much time and money and energy as possible in making money, trying to make money, optimizing making money. And that role of the good provider puts a lot of stress on men who are not able to fulfill their financial obligation. It also causes a lot of stress to men who can, in regard to possibly losing that ability or losing their jobs. So in a way, the influence of the separation of spheres on masculinity helps explain another aspect of contemporary Anglo-European manhood. Because do you remember the three elements that we discussed in chapter 4? No sissy stuff, be a sturdy oak, and give 'em hell. But there's a fourth element that we haven't talked about yet of that hegemonic masculinity model, and it is be a big wheel, which emphasizes the way masculinity is measured by power, success, wealth, and status. That's a lot of stress, right? So in the good provider role, economic success is directly linked to the family. But the big wheel role is mostly unconnected to the family. This is kind of a new phenomena, and it's a transformation that represents a general shift in masculinity in the United States from ideals that were based on men's role in the family to an increasing emphasis on success in the marketplace. So for women, what happens is this doctrine of separate spheres tells them that not only is the home their natural environment, but also that any desire to explore other areas are a violation of femininity. In the very beginning of the separate spheres ideology, a few decades ago, uh, women who were, not able to stay at home, like having a job, were considered those first workers. We talked about this in a previous chapter. Women in the first, factory workers, they were considered immoral, degenerate, fallen women, and the line between harlot and housewife was a thin one. I love this one. Doctors at the time worried that women who wanted an education had, quote, masculine brains. All right, so now we're going to move on. Now we're all working pretty much outside of the home, men and women. You have to economically to survive anymore if you can. So let's look at what's called the second shift. Okay, first, the household division of labor is the way in which the tasks of running a household are distributed. So in Anglo-European countries, they usually include childcare, cooking, cleaning, laundry, yard work, household maintenance, financial accounting, maintaining relationships with extended family, and car maintenance. Studies on the household division of labor since the 1960s have reached consensus on two facts. One, women do a larger share of household labor of all types. And that's what the second shift is. That's what it's called, the second shift. You work your shift all day at work and you come home and you work a second shift at home. You cook dinner, you take care of the kids, you do the laundry, you know, whatever. You know what that's like. Okay. So the second shift, which is childcare and housework, added on for women who are also in the paid workplace outside the home. Women work now. There's two. I looked these both up to see what I think. One is what your book says. Oh no, I see. It's what the text was written that they're explaining in 19 from. They had a statistic from 1989 in the text on how many hours more a woman works. I looked it up. It says they work an average of 20 hours longer per week than men. However, what I looked up on a different way of looking at it, which is much more time than the 20 hours a week, is it says today working mothers work the equivalent of 2.5 jobs. It's 2.5 jobs instead of one job. And that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I trust that one. This is true even for dual earner couples. When both spouses are working, even though it's more there's a more egalitarian division of labor, but nonetheless, it's pretty bad. So during the COVID epidemic, when people were working from home more, there was this assumption that that was going to change. There wouldn't be so much of a second shift because people were working from home, both, you know, in places, in situations where both parents were at home, that there would be a more equal division of labor. However, it didn't work out that way, and it could have even was worse for some families. During COVID, 1 in 3 employed mothers reported that they were the main caregivers in their family compared to only 1 in 10 fathers. Mothers did significantly more time doing housework and childcare than they did pre-pandemic. Children spent twice as, this is an interesting one, I thought, children spent twice as much time with telecommuting moms as they did with telecommuting dads. By early June of 2020, 30% of women without children and 34% with children reported being mildly depressed compared to only 19% of men. So how do we understand this household division of labor? And an interesting way to answer that question is, what happens if we take gender out of the equation? What if we look at families in which the gender of the adult couple is the same, gay and lesbian families, where there aren't really any gender norms as a guide for who does what? You know, how do you decide who makes the bed, cleans the toilet, changes the diapers, etc.? Because the division of labor among heterosexual couples is based on the power of gender, it's easier to make those decisions. So an institutional approach is that marriage as an institution comes with its own set of norms, as we've talked about. But what an individual wants is less important in that. You know, if you're coming with your own set of norms as an institution, then like marriage, then what the individual wants to do isn't nearly as relevant or important as what the institution says you should do. So, as we know, institutions provide sexual scripts, as we have seen, and they serve as guides for behavior. And escaping the prescribed division of labor is very difficult because the power of institutions to guide our actions is so strong. And here's an interesting and key point. Even attempts to violate the norms are, of course, responses to them. They're responses to the guidelines. So even though even though they challenge institutional norms, gay and lesbian couples, from the research is interesting, still follow the institutional norm of a wedding commitment or a ceremony. And I remember when gay marriage was first discussed and first became legal, and I know a couple of gay people, and I read an article too that said, why would we want to get married? Why would we want to buy in to that institution? And so I thought that was an interesting way of thinking about it. But as your text points out, even their challenge to the institution of marriage by getting married as a gay couple, it's still conditioned by the norms. And that's my point about saying, why would you even want to do that? To buy into an institution that is so currently so flawed. Another theoretical perspective often used to explain the persistent gender division of labor is what's called, remember doing gender that we talked about, one of the theories? So from the doing gender perspective, the most important location for gender is in our day-to-day interactions. So although marriage, yes, it's an institution, it places constraints on behavior as institutions do, and men and women follow gender norms about who does what, primarily as a performance of gender in representing masculinity and femininity from the doing gender perspective. Because the household division of labor is a very important way within family systems for the performance of gender. A man performs by working to support his family, prioritizing his role as breadwinner, and having less responsibility for housework and childcare. Now, an accountable performance doesn't have to be perfect, right? Just accountable. We learned about this in gender roles, okay, and doing gender. Fathers who are the primary caregivers of children are not assumed to be women, for example. So they're doing a woman's job by caring for the children, but they're not accountable as females. Remember that aspect of being accountable, being perceived as being accountable. Everybody knows they're men taking care of their children. And guess what happens? First of all, their behaviors are always understood within the division of labor. So these are men who don't work outside the home, but they take care of their children full time, and guess what? They're congratulated for their actions, especially by women. Okay? A woman who stays home for the same reason is not likely to be praised for it because it is what is expected of her, right? So when they looked at gay and lesbian households, what they found was that this is something that you should know, and it's interesting too. Increasingly, lesbian households consist of co-mothers. So increasingly, lesbian couples are having children either through donor insemination, which is the most common, or adoption, which is less frequent. And the division of household labor tends to be more equal, more egalitarian than in heterosexual couples in lesbian households. And lesbian households also demonstrate a higher level of satisfaction with their relationships and with each other as parents. As with heterosexual couples, the dynamics change when children enter the picture. Without children, like heterosexual couples, lesbians share housework more equally. Some researchers suggest that the egalitarianism in lesbian families might be related to race, social class, education, those kinds of things, rather than to their sexual identity. because there are differences among lesbian families, and they're much more diverse than the middle class, highly educated samples that are primarily used for research, once again. Okay? Because when they dug a little bit deeper, the researchers, they found that egalitarianism meant something different to Black lesbian families. These couples, the Black lesbian families, emphasized financial independence, labor work participation, and sharing the provider role. But the biological mothers did more housework and childcare than their partners and had more decision-making power in relation to the children. There's still a gap on the research on gay men who form families, but increasing numbers of gay men no longer see coming out as incompatible with having children. And when gay men do parent, they violate many versions, as you might imagine, of hegemonic masculinity. But here's a really key point. They are also violating some of the dominant sexual norms of gay culture when they have children, when they adopt, or, however they come by the children. So what about degendered parenting? And that's as practiced more by lesbian and gay couples, is a way of dividing childcare and housework based on personal choice, aptitude, and fairness, rather than a gender division of labor, which sounds like a very fair and sensible way of doing it. What would you prefer to do? This or that? Where are your best skills? Where do you enjoy? What do you enjoy? We all have to do household work. What do you enjoy doing the most? And what maybe the other person enjoys doing something else. So let's look at power in the household division of labor. And the first question, that is posited is, what's so bad about the separation of the world into public and private spheres, good providers and housewives? Well, that leads to some of the central questions of gender issues in general, right? Is it okay for men and women simply want to do different types of things? Does equality mean that everyone does the same things? Can you have equality and still acknowledge that women are better or more inclined to do certain things like taking care of children? And why does that have to make men and women unequal? And there is the main point, key point. It's not about what you prefer to do or what you're best at. It's the equality that is socially defined. One's more valuable than the other. That's the issue. Those are big questions without any obvious answers, of course. But we do know that our culture places a great deal more value on paid work. And that's where the problem comes in, once again, with caring for children and housework. And we know that the amount of power that a woman has in a family from research is related to the income that she contributes to that family. Not how wonderful a mom she is or how great a cook she is. It's how her value is based on how much money she contributes in the household. Because within the family itself, women's role as caretaker is not seen as that important as the role of economic provider. And so that leads to a lack of power inside the home, which translates to a lack of power outside the home as well. And so the threshold division of labor is important in explaining women's inequality across society beyond the family, because it creates a way of thinking about their value. And this study, which was so shocking to me, really says it all, okay? In one study that evaluated the skill necessary to do different jobs and the appropriate pay then that went with them, evaluators ranked attendance at dog pounds and parking lots over nursery school teachers, and ranked zookeepers higher than daycare workers. Now, as someone who wrote the Head Start grant for Coos and Curry County many, many, many years ago and worked in Head Start for many years. I just find that shocking that, people once again do not see the value, because this is a predominantly female occupation area, right? The younger the child, the more or the fewer men there are in it. When you get to high school, junior high, high school on up, you're going to find a lot of men in education, not in the littler grades. And if you know anything about early childhood education, that's the most important time. Okay, that's when children learn to learn, can learn to have self-esteem, learn to trust themselves. Those are all the things that in a good preschool, Head Start classroom, or even a mom or dad at home can do that, instill in children. But zookeepers are valued more higher and should be paid more than daycare workers. So one of the reasons that it's devalued so much, the jobs that women do among daycare and preschool, is because it's women doing them, and of course the pay's not very good, so they become devalued. They're among child care workers, both in daycare centers and in homes, are among the lowest paid workers in the United States. In addition, the U.S. in particular provides virtually no support for parents who would like to take time off to do childcare. And Sweden has the most wonderful, all the Scandinavian countries do, but I think Sweden was the first to do it. It's certainly most of the searches on the internet and things about it is Swedish paternity leave. And I put up a great little video for you to see about dads and paternity leave in Sweden. The US and Australia, this is really something. The US and Australia are the only industrialized nations that provide no federally mandated, in other words, you must do it, a business, paid parental leave. There's no federally mandated paid parental leave in only two industrialized nations in the world, the United States and Australia. All right, families, obviously, after this discussion, are, in transition. And we hear a lot about concern, a lot of discussion and concern about the state of marriage and the family. So it's important to remember, and if you're having this discussion with other people or seeing things, in media, that family is a fluid concept that differs from culture to culture, and it has differed historically over time very dramatically. So family differs, it's a fluid concept, differs from culture to culture, but the most basic two forms of the family are the nuclear family, mom, dad, and the kids, and the extended family, mom, dad, the kids, grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc. So the idea of, quote, family of choice that we learned about in chapter 6 and originated among gay and lesbian communities is spreading to include urban people in general who form tight-knit groups of friends, and they kind of friends, neighbors, co-workers, and they serve many of the functions of the family. Your book talks about Sex in the City or Girls for an example of that phenomenon, the TV shows. So that's what's called the postmodern family. The nuclear family, which consists of a husband, a wife, one male, one female, living in the same house with their children, where the father's expected to provide financial support and the mother stays home and takes care of the children. The nuclear family of the 1950s, probably. And then what's changing to is the postmodern family, as we just said. And the definition of the postmodern family is a changing, unsettled recombination of family forms. Because of this, the idea of a postmodern family makes it difficult to figure out exactly what defines a family and what's going on with families, precisely because it's always changing. So for the first time, according to census records in 2005, married couples are the minority category of households in the United States. And that means that most American households do not include a married couple. In 2019, about 4 in 10 adults between 25 and 54 were unpartnered, meaning they were neither married nor living with a partner. That's up from 29% in 1990, because that's about 40% in 2019. Men are not now more likely to be unmarried than women, which is a shift from 30 years ago when the reverse was true. Millennials are less likely than any other generation to be living with family in the traditional sense. 1 in 3 kids in the US lives in a single parent family, and Black and Native American children are more likely to be in single parent family. For Black children, 64% are in a single parent family. Native American children, 52% are in a single parent family. And although overall the divorce rate has fallen in the US, you've probably heard that the divorce rate has fallen in recent years, the rate of divorce after remarriage has increased. So the whole divorce rate has fallen, but it's gone up of divorce after someone has been divorced and remarried. So that's at a greater rate. And both, as we heard earlier in this chapter, both men and women are waiting longer to marry. And in the US, increasing numbers are living together and having children without ever marrying. And that includes large numbers of heterosexual couples who could marry in every state if they chose to. So if we remember that part of the modern family includes the ideal of the male sole breadwinner, dependent children, and mother as caretaker and homemaker, then the percentage is even smaller. Because in 2017, 41% of mothers were the sole single breadwinners. That's getting up there to 50%, right? It's 41%. You can see why some people are freaking out, as I said. However, we can take some comfort in thinking about how many different forms of the family there have been over times and cultures. What's so shocking about that figure of 41% of mothers are the sole breadwinners today in American families is not that it's single mothers, it's the poverty that means. Women make much less than men. We just zookeepers should make more money than nursery school teachers. So, that's what's the real issue here. I'm not saying that fathers aren't important or a second person in the household is not important, who's responsible and loves children. But I'm saying when you look at that percentage of 41%, the vast majority of those are kids living in families that are struggling financially. So, yes, families have taken many forms over many eons and different cultures. And the modern family, as we're going to discuss in the next chapter, in the modern family, it's virtually an impossibility, for many people, if not most families, to survive on one income. That's what we're just talking about. The 41% of families with a mother was the only breadwinner. So what we call family in the 21st century is probably going to look very different, but it still will be extremely important to us as individuals and as an institution in society as well. As we've seen in this chapter, in relation to gender, marriage and family can really show us the complex ways that the institutions of society become places to establish gender differences and gender power differences as well.